Welcome to the Babylonian. I'm the co-host Peter, and this season we're going to be exploring the New Testament Apocrypha. If you'd like to, there's going to be summaries and notes at thebabylonian.com, which you can find in the description. With that being said, with the sages, scholars, and the scriptures, let's Bible on.
Peter, good morning.
Good morning. But also
How do you-
to the listeners who are not in the morning, good evening.
Yes. Yeah. Good evening. Good middle of the night. Good midday, wherever you're at. We are starting this morning off with some apocalyptic literature, Christian apocalyptic literature specifically, as we're going through the New Testament Apocrypha. So the first thing to know about apocalyptic literature is that this is not a uniquely Christian genre. As a matter of fact, it's originally a Jewish genre that we're going to see Christians adapt and kind of make their own. So, Revelation is obviously the one canonical Christian apocalyptic text that even that kind of struggled to get some support behind it in the first couple centuries of the church. But then, in the Old Testament, you have one apocalyptic text, Daniel, and then some proto-apocalyptic kind of scenes from a bunch of the other prophets, Zechariah, Ezekiel. I don't think Jeremiah. There's a little bit of Isaiah, but nonetheless, apocalyptic comes from the Greek word apocalypto, which means to reveal or unveil or uncover something. Not that it was a Greek idea of apocalypse, but that's
Which
just
is
where the
why-
word comes from.
Which is why it's called Revelation, because it's revealing something.
Yeah. Yeah. So in Greek, the word would have been, well, I don't know what the noun form is. Maybe apocalypsis. I don't know. And actually, Peter, do you want to real quick explain the difference between kind of the modern usage of the word apocalyptic? Like if you're going to say, oh, I'm going to watch an apocalyptic movie, a movie about the apocalypse today, versus how that word might have been used in the early centuries. I kind of did a little bit of that in explaining the word, but
Yeah. So now when we talk about the apocalypse, we're talking about the end of the world. So there's an inherent, the world's going to end, whether that's through zombies, a zombie apocalypse, or I don't know, some kind of disease or aliens. So apocalypse means the end of the world to us. To them, it means like revelation. It's kind of, my understanding is like, it's like a pulling back of what's going on in the reality. Like behind all the scenes, there is such and such happening. So that is,
yeah.
I've read in commentaries about like books like Ephesians being apocalyptic, but even though it's not like it's an epistle, but it's got apocalyptic themes because it's talking about what's going on behind, the world that we experience now.
Yeah. And that's good. I was just reading a kind of a short intro on apocalyptic literature the night before in preparation. It was interesting to see, I'd read this before, but it's interesting to see just kind of a real short explanation that some scholars would even say that the apocalyptic isn't as much a genre as much kind of a perspective within religion. And I think there's truth to that as well. You definitely see in Judaism leading up to Christianity, two big streams of Judaism. You have Pharisaicism, which is, and of course there's other, minor sects, but just two big movements of Pharisaicism, which is so set on the law and how to interpret the law. And so Moses is their big person of like, we want to know that we have all the interpretation of the law down. And then on the other hand, with the Essenes and, not just them, but they were really big on it. And, proto-Christian Jewish thought was very apocalyptic. Enoch was their big character because it's just this like random, well, not random, but this character that has like this much mention in the fifth chapter of the Old Testament. And he apparently, according to the Septuagint, got translated to be with God. What happened with that, and just kind of very, very much a fascination with the divine workings behind everything. And, these texts, at least in the Jewish form, they tend to have, God comes to some major Old Testament character. It's written pseudonymously. It's a pseudepigrapha, pseudepigraphon. So, in other words, it's claiming to be written by someone it's not, which thus far we've already had. That doesn't mean that it is apocalyptic, but that's one part that tends to be true of apocalypses. And so God comes to this person. He tells them that the people in their day are sinful and that they need to preach against them, usually. And then there's this usually an angel that comes and gives this person a divine tour throughout the multi layers of heavens, debates as to whether there's 3 or 7. And when someone looks up and even sees 1,000, usually look at the realm of the dead, the people who are dead, kind of their science behind things, of angels who are in charge of winds and all these different things, a calendar. Pretty much anything that you need to explain is there explained. And usually although it's not necessarily a view as to the end of time, although frequently that is also the case, a lot of the times it's for a message for the end times. The people that are writing it do see the day of the Lord, climactic, eschatological battle coming up. And so they're writing this text kind of as a way to, just give people ethical encouragement, but, over that, give them a divine perspective on, what has been happening and what is continuing to happen. That being said, and I'll preface all the other apocalypses that we jump into going forward, but I do want to preface these by saying that these people, these authors, are using very strong language and imagery to take a capture of your psyche, your mind, and to shake you awake, to show you, by the way, you need to watch how you're living right now. And in this instance, in Christian apocalyptic literature, to shake you awake, to make you mindful of somebody who's living in obedience and faithfulness to Christ. So that being said, if you get disturbed by certain images, there's going to be an apocalyptic tour. They're going to look into hell and see people being punished for some pretty filthy sins. And the punishments are going to be quite embarrassing. So if you have little ears, or if that stuff makes you kind of queasy, I just want to give you a heads up for this episode and the episodes to come, which I will also give heads up in those episodes as well. But apocalyptic literature in any form and any age is always super intense. So, that being said, a little bit of a rundown on apocalyptic literature. We're going to start off, Peter, with your apocalypse, the Apocalypse of Peter. And this was written in the early 2nd century. The author that I'm reading nails down the dates to 132 to 135. It was originally written in Greek. We have references from Clement of Alexandria, Methodius, Macarius, Eusebius, Sozomen, the Muratorian Fragment, the Stichometry of Nicephorus, Theophilus of Antioch. So, a decent amount of references there. There is an important note to make. There's a vast amount of New Testament apocryphal literature, especially a bunch of Gnostic writings. A lot were found in the Nag Hammadi community. One is named the Apocalypse of Peter as well. This is a Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter, and this does not have any relationship to that text at all whatsoever. It's just that two people were fond of Peter and wanted to give him an apocalyptic experience. This text is listed as canonical in the Codex Claromontanus, along with the Shepherd of Hermas and the Acts of Paul. And it was used in worship on Good Friday by the 5th century. So that's pretty rad.
So you're saying that this particular text thought that this was part of the Bible, as well as they also thought Shepherd of Hermas was, and I don't remember what the other one you mentioned.
Yeah, Shepherd of Hermas and Acts of Paul.
Dang. Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah. So, and it was even used in some liturgies around Easter, which is pretty rad. The Ethiopic text that we have today seems to be original, like preserving the original Greek, but the slightly different Akhmim text seems to have been adapted to fit with the Gospel of Peter. The Apocalypse of Peter is the earliest Christian text describing heaven and hell. So if you want to get a view for what the earliest Christians post-New Testament thought about those spaces, this is the text. And the apocalypses of Paul and Thomas seem to take Peter's vision of heaven and hell and have been influenced by it. So this is like the proto-evangelium of James or the infancy gospel of Thomas to apocalyptic texts. It inspired the Apocalypse of Paul and Apocalypse of Thomas, and some have even claimed that its influence goes all the way to Dante, although some would say just go back to Jewish and Greco-Roman literature for that. Nonetheless, it's had some it's a very influential early apocalyptic text. And then some scholars claim that it taught universalism, and so that's why it ended up being suppressed. And so that comes to a some part at the end when we'll talk about that. But yeah, so with that, let's just jump into the text. So the text opens up, and Peter and the disciples come to ask Jesus about the signs of his coming and the end of the world while they're on the Mount of Olives. Jesus tells them to learn from the fig tree. When its shoots come forth and twigs grow, then will the end of the world come. Peter doesn't understand, since the fig tree grows shoots every year. Jesus explains that the fig tree is Israel. Some false Messiah will come, and they will follow him. Then they will reject him and be slain and martyred. And that is when the fig tree shoots forth, and Enoch and Elijah will come to teach. They will come to teach them that this false Messiah came to deceive them. So again, Enoch and Elijah, those are the two Old Testament characters who never die, at least in Christian tradition. There's some debates about, interpreting those texts. And of course, you have Revelation that talks about two prophets who are going to witness against the people. This seems to be interpreting those as the two E's. Then Jesus shows the souls of all men in his right hand, and they see how the sinners are separated and weep as they are afflicted. Peter asks if it were better for them if they had not been created. And Jesus asks how they could say such a thing. You would not have more compassion than God for his image. He tells him how he will show him what will become of them all. And yeah, so and last text was actually, like apocalyptic. The last text that we went over, the Epistle of the Apostles. But I kind of mentioned in there that the apocalyptic literature has this motif of kind of intercession for sinners and the ungodly and people who are going to be damned. Usually this righteous Old or New Testament character is asking God to have mercy upon them and to speak up on behalf of them. But something that apocalyptic texts do is they kind of frequently bring up this tension of God's justice and the wicked way of the world. And then they kind of say, there's this divine mystery, there's this level of understanding that we can't even attain to today. And so you just need to trust in God's wisdom. This is kind of, what we're getting here is that, like, God knows better. You're not in a place to challenge God. God is the wise creator and sustainer of the universe. And so just kind of trust in him. They kind of bring up these issues and tensions that these authors were definitely feeling and dealing with. But then they put them up to say, like, hey, there are things that are beyond us that, we won't be able to understand. Then Jesus describes how animals will give up men that they devoured, and all people will be recreated just as God had created the world. And as Ezekiel had prophesied in saying that the bones will connect to bones, sinews, nerves, flesh, skin, and hair. Darkness will cover the earth, and fire will be let loose as streams that flow until there is a gnashing of teeth. Then people will see him coming on a bright cloud with angels. A crown will be set on his head, and the nations will see it and weep. He will command the righteous to come up and be with him, while he will command the unrighteous to go into the river of fire, where they will be punished according to their evil deeds. So here, there's a reference to, we already talked about this again in the last episode, where there was this Christian concern with what's going to happen with bodies that are totally dismembered. What's it going to look like in the resurrection? And there's this explanation of, well, in the valley of dry bones, where God tells Ezekiel to prophesy to these bones and tell them to be put together and to become full-on human people. Well, if God told Ezekiel to prophesy that, then that must mean that can be something that actually happens in the resurrection. And so I don't know if this is missing. Yeah.
And if the animals ate someone, they got to like spit them up so that they can do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So wherever your body is, it's going to be resurrected is pretty much the explanation, even if it's been, sitting in their animal digestive system for, a decade and a half. But I don't know if this is a misinterpretation or just taking Ezekiel and taking something from that and trying to apply that where it's not necessarily read in the way that it is. But Ezekiel's whole Valley of the Dry Bones vision is not about a literal and physical resurrection. Not that we in any way deny that will happen, but that prophecy is a sign. It's an act to show the people of Israel how God is going to give them new life and bring them back from exile. So, even though there is a vision of God putting all those things together and, it could be read in that way, the immediate intended understanding of that passage is that God is going to bring the people of Israel back from exile. They're dead in exile, and God is going to give them new life on the other side. So then Peter sees another dark and dirty place where angels clothed with the air of the place punish the unrighteous. Those who blasphemed the way of the righteous are hung by their tongues over fire. So, again, they use their tongues to blaspheme and to slander. And so now they got their tongues either nailed to the roof of hell or whatever it is. Women who adorn themselves for adultery are hung by their hair. And, in this time, hair was more of a sexual thing. And men who joined them, in other words, committed adultery with them, are hung by their loins over the mire. Murderers are thrown into a gorge of evil with creeping things, where they are attacked by beasts because they also attacked other people and killed them. And those murdered by them say, God, righteous is your judgment. The excrement of those in torment goes down into a lake where women sit into it, going up to their necks, and their children who they had conceived out of wedlock and aborted are crying, and rays of fire smite the women in their eyes. Those who were false witnesses gnawed their tongues and had fire in their mouths. Those who reveled in their riches and didn't pity the orphans and widows are clothed in filthy rags, rolling around in stones sharper than swords and heated with fire. Those who behaved as the other sex or committed homosexuality are brought up to a high rock to be cast down to the bottom, only to go up and to do it again. Those who made and worshipped idols hit one another with hot rods of iron. And those who forsook the way of God, which I think is talking about apostasy, tossed and turned as they roasted in fire. So again, per the disclaimer at the beginning, very intense imagery. But the point is, for each of these sins and punishments, the punishment fits the sin. And I think we've explained this in an earlier episode, but this is a major apocalyptic motif, especially in Christian apocalypticism, where we're seeing the specific punishments for criminals and cosmic criminals, sinners, and the punishment fits the crime. And so the term for this that's really going to be used to talk about, when we get all the way up until what is like the 14th century, when we have Dante's Inferno written, is contrapasso, according to the sin is the crime. And so some of these I can't necessarily work out. This is all in the mind of the author. And so, as I explained, for the example of adultery, women who commit adultery and they're hung by their hair, that's, a little bit less intuitive for people today who might not, especially if you don't know that hair was seen as more of a sexualized part of the body back then. So this is obviously according to the author in their day, how they saw things. But in each of these instances, the punishment fits the crime of what they did. So then Jesus describes that he will give his righteous elect the baptism and then Jesus describes that he will give his righteous elect the baptism and the salvation for which they have besought me. He will bring them to a field full of flowers and rejoice with them. Jesus then tells Peter to go into the city and preach about the suffering Son so that people may rejoice. And Jesus goes with them to the holy mountain to pray. They see two good-looking, very bright men. And Peter asks who these two people are. And Jesus says they are Moses and Elijah. Peter asks where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the rest of the fathers are. And Jesus shows them a great open garden full of perfumes and plants. Peter rejoices and then asks if Jesus wants for them to make a tabernacle. Peter rejoices and then asks if Jesus wants for them to make a tabernacle for all of them. And Jesus responds, Satan makes war against you and has veiled your understanding, and the good things of this world prevail against you. Your eyes, therefore, must be opened. You must have an apocalypse, and your ears unstopped, that you may see a tabernacle, not made with human hands, which my heavenly Father has made for me and for the elect. And they see it and rejoice.
That's a reference to the transfiguration.
Yeah. And, Jesus tells Peter to preach the suffering Son before that. So I would have assumed that this is post-resurrection because, according to all the canonical gospels, the disciples are so confounded and have no idea when Jesus is directly telling them how he's going to die and rise again. But perhaps this is like a redo or something because Peter's also confused. But maybe, I think what probably makes the most sense is that this is, Jesus has just shown him this apocalypse. And somehow Peter's going to understand for this moment, and this is pre-transfiguration. But yeah, this is the transfiguration. So then a voice from heaven says, it is pleased with his Son who kept his commandments. And a white cloud comes over their heads and takes Jesus, Moses, and Elijah away. They see heaven opened and men in the flesh greet the three. Then heaven is shut and they go down the mountain praying and glorifying God. And then continues the Ethiopic, where Peter explains these things to Clement. However, later, Peter can't take thinking about the destiny of sinners. He weeps for hours, and Jesus says to him not to tell sinners what he is going to tell him, lest they continue in their sin. He says he is returning for his righteous and elect, but he will pity sinners because of the prayers of his righteous and elect. And Peter tells Clement to hide the apocalypse in a box so that the foolish will not read it. In other words, my understanding and interpretation of this is that Peter is still worried about the fate of people who continue in their sin. And Jesus's point is, because of the prayers of the righteous, those are going to be saved anyways. And so this is that universalist passage that I'm guessing the reason it only survives in the Ethiopic is because it got chopped in the Achaemenid text. So there you have it. That's the whole apocalypse of Peter. So Peter, what are your thoughts? How do you index this text?
Well, I mean, I don't know that there's anything that, specifically goes against like Orthodox Christianity, and it has a lot of references to the Bible. And so I'd probably put it as a 10.
Yeah, I think I'd give it a 10 as well. Yeah, it's kind of short, but like you said, I don't think there's anything wrong or false in it. Well, okay, I disagree with Universalism. So, maybe I disagree with the Ethiopic version. So I think for that reason, I'd give it an 8. But other than that, I'd say this is a Orthodox text. I do think that it's interesting that Peter, kind of weeps over these sinners and asks, what's going to happen for them? Wouldn't it be better if they weren't created? And Jesus says, you don't have more compassion than God. And then, that's kind of Jesus's explanation. And then in the end, Jesus, like after Peter is weeping about them more, Jesus says, well, they are going to be saved. Just don't tell them so they don't continue in their sin and then get punished and then, are received into the resurrection anyways. So that's kind of interesting. But I guess like Jesus says, you don't have more compassion than God for his image. I guess his point is that God does have a lot of compassion. You don't necessarily know what that looks like. In the end, it interprets that as like, Jesus has so much compassion, and even because the righteous are calling for the salvation of these who are being punished, God will save them. But I do think, personally, I think that universalism, the idea, and I think there are multiple forms of universalism. I haven't looked into this too much, but I think one pretty popular image is that even though some people will go into hell is more of kind of a denial of hell and just a full-on belief in purgatory, even though it's a pretty disgusting, horrid purgatory. It's really just a temporal punishment that ends up restoring people and bringing them back into the kingdom of heaven. That's my understanding of at least a pretty popular form of universalism. And so I have problems with that, the dogmatic belief that everyone is going to be saved. I currently don't think that people can be saved from hell. There's a very interesting part in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, which is, in my opinion, a modern apocalypse, just as much as Dante's Inferno and this text are apocalyptic texts, even though they're not, Second Temple Jewish literature. But there's an interesting part where I think it's the main character, C.S. Lewis, who's, seeing everything, talks with George MacDonald, and he's asking questions as he sees these characters who are in hell going and visiting heaven, and they hate heaven so much they want to go back. And so, C.S. Lewis has this famous line of like, in the end, there are those who say to God, thy will be done, and there are those to whom God says, thy will be done. And so hell is really a giving to sinners what they ultimately desire. It's one of the most, in a sense, according to this line of thought, it's one of the most like merciful things that God can do is give them over into the consequences of their actions. But there is a section in which, and I can't remember exactly how the conversation goes, but pretty much C.S. Lewis asks George MacDonald about purgatory, and George MacDonald's response is that for some people, hell is hell, and for some people, hell is just purgatory, in as much as their suffering in hell leads them to repentance, and they do return and then, go back into the kingdom of heaven. So that's an interesting idea to think about. I'm not sure where I'm at on it. I don't see biblical support for it personally. Doesn't mean I can ever see it. That's also another thing to be said. That's also another thing to say to Christians who might think that universalism is entirely out of the picture. There have been some master theologians and philosophers Christian philosophers who are very much orthodox in everything else, if you believe that this is, entirely out of orthodoxy, and have nonetheless been universalist. So, I myself don't consider myself universalist, but, I think Gregory of Nyssa or one of the Cappadocian fathers early on, I think there have been some interpretations of Athanasius. And so I've heard that there have been like some pretty solid Christian thinkers that have at least speculated that there might be universalism in every age. I think Origen, although, that's been a little bit, that's a little bit of a spicier version of universalism, where even I think he speculates that even the Satan and his demons might be saved in the end. So,
well, I do think so. Yeah, like I think the biblical case, like looking at the canon, the case for universalism is I have a lot of hesitation looking at it, right? Because like you look at like passages like John 3:16, it says, "For God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life." Right? And so like it's like, well, hold on. If some people, like, it seems to be dissecting between two kinds of people, and so like like it's like, okay, is it really, is universalism really a good reading of the biblical texts? What about Matthew 25, where he's separating people like sheep and goats? But I've heard one person kind of try to make a case for universalism, and I think they drew it based on the idea that like whenever you look at patterns of people, so the story of the Bible, there's a continual pattern of God's people rejecting him, and then they get sent into punishment, and then they get taken out. And so they'd say, okay, well, it's probably just a continued on a personal, individual level. And so that's probably what's going to happen. I'm skeptical of that. I don't really think that's the best way to read the Bible, but I think that's one way that people look at it. And then I think if you want to give like, another verse that could be interpreted that way, I think there's one in, is it 1 Timothy 2, where he, not the last half, but the first half, where he says like he requests that supplications and prayers be sent to all people, for all people. I'm not actually particularly sure on this one, but I think there's a passage in Timothy that some universalists might look at and say, okay, well, God desires all to be saved, therefore all will be saved. So I think if you want to make a case for it, but yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the best way to read the Bible. I don't think that's the most clear way to read the Bible. I think the God of the Bible punishes the unjust, and the just shall live by faith.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. I think, I haven't looked into it, but how universalists would read the Bible, but I don't see a case for it. I think philosophically I still have problems with it, but things like that passage from The Great Divorce, I think are pretty, at least interesting to think about. But yeah,
I think
so
if you want like a steel man, like someone who's going to probably make a strong case for universalism, David Bentley Hart. I think he has a book called That All Should Be Saved. I haven't read it, so I can't speak on it, but I think David Bentley Hart is really, really smart and worth reading or listening to, however you like to take it, if someone's interested in universalism.
Yeah, that's a good mention. I haven't read that either. I've read one of his philosophy books on God, which is 20 feet deep, and you're treading water to understand. But I think that's a good recommendation there. Yeah. Okay. Good thoughts. That's the Apocalypse of Peter, and next week we'll be looking at the Apocalypse of Paul. Until then, Bible on.